get the discussion going. You guys, everybody always already knows this, but I always bring it up anyway. This is meant to be an engaging conversation. Please feel free to ask questions along the way. Nothing is off the table. As everybody knows, from a stereotypical perspective, people in Canada are very nice. They're very happy to answer questions, right, Themis?
Yes.
We've joked about this in the past as well. So throw your questions up in the chat. We'll get to them as we talk through our discussion this morning. So Themis, do you want to start and talk to us about...
Yes, Yes, thank you, Ken. Thank you so much. First of all, thank you, Ken, for this special invitation. We are very happy to be part of this SMLA event and participating in this event. I also would like to note that Sabine is also on from Talentor. So thank you for joining as well, Sabine. So Richard and I are business partners for the last 25 years at ExperTech. We are based in Montreal, but we have an office in Toronto as well. We are a recruiting firm. We specialize in information technology, accounting and finance, and executive search for the last 25 years. Of course, when I say 25 years, it ages us. So I tell people we started when we were 14. But the truth is we've been working together for at least 30 years. And really are passionate about recruiting and finding the right talent for our clients. So I'm going to start off with, because this is really about Canada and the US. And one thing you probably all know, Canada's border with the United States is the world's longest international border between two countries at 5,524 miles. About 8,900 kilometers for those of us in Canada. And it is the longest undefended border. And you know, I'll make a little joke. If ever the US did want to attack Canada, we would surrender within 10 seconds, okay? However, this is the longest border without any conflict. And these two countries are intertwined both, well, economically, socially, and politically. A joke that we make in Canada is when the US sneezes, we catch a cold. So what happens in your country really does affect Canada, especially when we're talking about business, our economy, and many of our sectors. What do most Canadians think about the US? Well, most Canadians realize we only have one neighbor. If we look at where we are, there's the Arctic Ocean to the north, Pacific Ocean to the west, Atlantic Ocean to the east, and we only have one neighbor, which is also particular. Very few countries in the world can say they only have one neighbor. And we do love thy neighbor. I think most Canadians see the US as our big brother, someone who will always take care of us. And most Canadians have a very positive feeling and overview where the United States is concerned. Apart from that, though, our leading export market is the US, and our leading import market is the US. So our economy is really intertwined with your US economy. We'll talk a little bit about the differences between Canada and the US, but I will present my business partner, Richard, who will start talking about our current situation, COVID, and how that has had an impact here in Canada. And then we can look at some differences between Canada and the US and opportunities for US companies in Canada.
All right, thank you, Themis. So as Themis was mentioning, this is the world's largest trading partnership by far. I know if you took a poll of most American business people, what is the biggest trading relationship in the world? Some would guess Canada, US, some would guess European Union, US. It's not even close. Really the biggest bilateral trading relationship in the world is Canada and the US. Themis mentioned that it goes way beyond business. It's even families, for heaven's sake. There are families sitting on, I think Arthur was mentioning Bellingham, Washington, and Vancouver, British Columbia. There are families literally with a backyard in one country, looking across their neighbors in a backyard in Canada. So very, very integrated in every aspect. I would go so far as to venture that Canadians are watching as much, if not even more news during an election campaign than most Americans are, if you can believe that. So
That's true.
That's not healthy for you guys. It's not healthy for us either.
Yeah, that's it. Well, this is not the forum. We won't get into politics or election campaigns, but suffice it to say that if as American business people, if you're asking how we view the United States, as Themis mentioned, it's a very positive relationship. It's a dependency, quite honestly, and there's a lot of affinities as well. And everything that happens in the U.S., Themis made that joke. That's a very common joke when America sneezes, Canada catches the cold. It's actually quite true. Anything that happens in the United States has some sort of impact. So we're constantly absorbing U.S. news. It could be anything from, the Affordable Care Act, and how does that change us? How does it change our pharmaceutical sales? And I mean, everything you guys do has an impact on us. So every news event that goes on in the U.S. So I think sometimes it's hard for Americans to fathom just how locked in we are to U.S. politics, U.S. economic debates, and so on. So whether it's an election year or not, everything you guys do has some sort of impact and kind of feeds into any business decision, planning decision. So it's not just electoral politics; it's really business climate, and so definitely very.
Richard, I'm curious because you guys have an office in Montreal and also in Toronto, correct?
Right, exactly.
And so I'm curious: is it different? I mean, that's two very different cultures that we've talked about in the past. Right. Is the connection to the U.S. different? Is the attitude about the U.S. and cross-border interaction different in those two cities?
I would say maybe in some aspects, yes. I think fundamentally, I know Themis will want to talk about that in a few moments, but I think the receptiveness to doing business with the United States is pretty much the same across the board. Mm-hmm. There are regional disparities. Alberta is a very resource-based economy. Montreal has very strong pharmaceutical and IT and knowledge-based industry. So, but I think overall the culture is, or the receptiveness of doing business with the United States is quite similar. I don't think the barriers to doing business in Canada differ from Quebec than, let's say, Ontario. There may be, things like taxation rates and unionization rates and things like that, certainly that factor in. But I would say that across the board, Canada is always willing. And in fact, it's not even a question of willingness. It's necessity to do business with the U.S. As we're kind of hammering that point home. We have one neighbor, one border. And, if we lose that export market, for example, that's sayonara for Canada's economy. So,
right, yeah, sure.
So you can, I'll just give a quick example. When President Trump a few years ago wanted to renegotiate NAFTA, or actually abolish NAFTA and replace it with something else, I can tell you there was a lot of anxiety in Canada how that was. Everything turned out fine despite all the bluster and the nerves and everything turned out okay. It was a fair deal for all parties concerned. But you can imagine, it's hard to kind of relay the anxiety that business people had in Canada for those few months of kind of renegotiating that. So that's a last mention of politics.
Yeah. How has the kind of physical crossing of the border changed? I mean, I know actually Joseph just asked a question about that too, in terms of just the borders. Also, we're actually working the search I mentioned earlier. We have a client that's based in Spain. And it's the role itself as a sales position, believe it or not, covering the western part of the U.S. and the upper northeast as well of the U.S. And Canada. And so our final candidate that actually is going to get the job lives in Quebec, believe it or not. So one of the concerns, though, in the negotiation was how easily he'll be able to cross the border into the U.S. to be able to come over and visit our clients here. So I'm curious about what, if any, changes you guys have seen or impediments you've seen with COVID.
So yes, and thank you, Joseph, for that question. Right now, each provincial premier, a bit like each of your state governors, has promoted travel within our province. And what we see in Quebec, and we see in Ontario, and we see in British Columbia, people are spending money traveling within their province and when allowed within their country. But of course, there will be loss of revenue in tourism for Canada. For the United States as well, because the Canadian snowbirds, as we call them, that usually by November fly down to Florida, thousands and tens of thousands of people that come to warmer weather this year are putting those plans to the side. So that will affect the American tourism definitely. But when it comes to business, so although there's there's discussion that the border is closed for land travel. So Americans and Canadians can't really, cross the border by car. That does not apply to flight. And if people are working, if people are flying into the US for business, for work, or even for a family reason, that is allowed. So people are able to travel between Canada and the US through flight. I know for some people it doesn't make sense, but they are not able to cross the border by car. So business is still going on and people are still flying into the US and into Canada. Richard, I don't know if
and it hasn't affected, to answer Joseph's question, hasn't affected transportation. So essential goods can move across the border. So trucking has not been impeded at all. In fact, I was reading an article maybe a month or so ago that it's pretty much the same numbers as last year, as if there was no pandemic, as far as transportation of goods is concerned. So and rail transportation. So definitely hasn't had that impact on that level. But of course, when business people can't travel, if they can't prove it's essential, certainly there are, as with your search can, it does impact a lot of transactions. But commercial goods, it hasn't had any impact at all to this point.
Great. And what's kind of just another question also that came up, which I was on my list also, was just in general, what is the perception and or expectation for let's say the first quarter of next year with COVID? I mean, have people really kind of lowered their projections, expectations, their budgets, their spending, those kinds of things?
Okay, well, it's an excellent question. I know we're all kind of entering into, have entered into pandemic fatigue a long time ago, so I don't want to kind of replay the record, but maybe just kind of go through a quick recap of how Canada responded to the pandemic when it first hit hard back in March, and kind of where we're at today in mid-October, heading into the colder months. So I would say, I know in the US, it didn't hit. It wasn't very synchronized, right? I mean, we all know that it hit New York State and New Jersey in ways that perhaps Georgia and Arizona didn't feel until later on, right? So if you're, quick cheat sheet type of information, if you're looking for how, or the trajectory of the pandemic and how it affected Canada, it was very, very correlated to what New York, New Jersey, Massachusetts were feeling. So very, very heavily hit, heavy lockdown, where the population was quite compliant, and really a major earthquake in the way people live and work. Again, the major milestones. Into May, the numbers dropped. The lockdown had a big effect. The numbers of cases and death count started going down very, very quickly, so that by mid-May into June, even though kids were not in school anymore, there was talk of bringing them back into class for the last 2-3 weeks of school. And so things kind of hit a sort of normalcy in the summer months. The case counts were extremely low, astonishingly low. It almost felt like, this is just a very personal observation, mind you, I don't know if Themis will agree, it almost felt at some points in June, July, and August that there was no pandemic. There was mask wearing, there was a lot of compliance on that level. Outdoor restaurants had opened up. Big office towers were still closed, but there was a kind of psychological feeling that, this is a piece of cake. And now, really, since the kids have gone back to school just before Labor Day, our school year starts last week of August, things have picked up. They got extremely, we were going from case counts, let's say in Quebec and Ontario, from 100 new cases per day, which is very low, especially if you compare it to the peaks that New York State and we were feeling back in April. All of a sudden hit 300 a day, 400 a day, 700, 1,000 a day about 2 weeks ago. And really the diagnosis, I would say, is that, we all realize that this is not just a case count that was increasing, it was a second wave. So we're in the second wave now. There's no, I don't know, Themis, if you agree, but the second wave is upon us. And we're now back into, I wouldn't say lockdown as it was in, back in March, April. It was almost like we were mimicking Italy and New York City. It was very, very severe. Schools are still open, but restaurants have been shut until October 28th. We'll see what happens with that. After school activities for kids have been shut down for 3 weeks. So we're now at that point where we're kind of in another lockdown, and what is the next step? So again, forgive me for kind of reliving the entire last 6 months. I just want to kind of, I just want to kind of give you an idea of the trajectory that that we're at, and right now we're back up there into a second wave. We seem to have tamped it down a little bit. So, you know, there's some hope going into the fall that some of these measures, and I will say that compliance in the Canadian population has been pretty high. It hasn't been as, you know, controversial, I would say, some of the measures, although there is some controversy. But now to answer your question, Ken, it's a long-winded answer. I think there's a lot of hopefulness. I think we've discovered a lot of, and we can get into some specifics in a few moments, but Themis and I are, you know, based on what we've read, based on what we've heard from our clients, based on what we're experiencing day to day in terms of new requisitions and new business coming in, certainly bruised. The Canadian economy is certainly bruised, but I think there's a resiliency there that we may have underestimated, and I'm quite optimistic for 2021 overall. That's sort of a big picture, or my own prognostication, will say. So, very long-winded answer. We can get into more specifics, but
that's great. Yeah.
Does that help you in any way?
I think Richard, you do have some of the studies from Toronto Dominion TD Economics that has demonstrated that September we had major gains in employment here in Canada, and they are expecting some kind of rebound for the last quarter. And of course, a vaccine comes in early 2021. The first quarter of 2021 can see an increase in business activity, and definitely it looks like the economy can, you know, sustain some growth. There was an interesting question from Joseph. Richard being an avid hockey player, Joseph has asked if what is Canada doing to make sure people can, people can still play hockey, and what's happening with the NHL. So I'm going to leave that to Richard to answer that Joseph just asked.
Joseph, I'm sorry to say you've hit a sore spot, because my adult old-timer hockey league has been shut down for the next 4 weeks. So there's no hockey for me for the next 4 weeks. On a serious note, youth sports have been shut down. So when I'm talking about like a second lockdown,
no hockey,
no after-school activities, no hockey, no ballet, for no soccer. Basically the kids have been told to go to class and then go home. Essentially, that's where we're at this point in October. So
that's interesting. I mean, in the U.S. here, it depends on the area, but there are some, kind of private groups or soccer clubs or baseball clubs or travel clubs that are kind of the higher level that are still playing. And yet a lot of the school activities that are, school sports are not happening. So it's an interesting kind of a dichotomy here, or kind of a split, I guess.
Yeah, I would say the Ontario and Quebec governments just didn't want to be caught up in the why them and not me. You know what I'm saying? Sure. So it's sort of like a blanket.
Right.
So
yeah, exactly.
But this is temporary. It will be
right.
It's going to be for 3 weeks, and then they will reevaluate, and we're going to take it from there. I wanted to add some of the differences between the two countries. We were talking about how intertwined the two economies are and our two countries are. And I did forget to mention, apart from having the longest border, Canada, as you know, is the second largest country in terms of space, but we have a bit less, our entire population is just a tad less than in California. So California, from what I saw in 2019, has 39.5 million people. Canada's entire population is 38 million. So it gives you a bit of a perspective about our economy and our sectors, et cetera. But some of the differences are, doing some research for this event, Canada has 2 official languages. So we have English and French as an official language across the country. Provinces, though, have power over language. So in Quebec, for example, French is the only official language. In New Brunswick, French and English are both official languages. In Ontario, it is English. But across Canada, Canada is a bilingual country. I found it interesting that the United States of America does not have an official language. So I did not know that upon the writing of the Constitution, The forefathers of the US did not think it was important to include unofficial language and sort of allowed the economy and the reality of the US to dictate the common language, which already shows differences between the US and Canada. Definitely, when we look at the US, we look at entrepreneurial spirit, we look at, the capitalist model in its possible success. We talk about the American dream. We don't talk about the Canadian dream. So definitely there are differences. So when it comes to culture, for a lot of Americans and even Canadians, when we talk about French language and French culture here in Quebec, they sort of take a step back. But Quebec, with 8 million people and an official language that is French, yes, thrives and is doing very well within the French language and culture. But as a whole, our country, and not to get political, but we're known as the country with universal health care, a generous employment insurance program. We have a generous parental leave program. For example, a mom or dad can take up to 12 months. A mom who's just given birth can take 12 months of maternity leave without losing her position and is actually paid by employment insurance for 12 months and can take an additional 3 months without pay. So a maternity leave of 15 months, which I'm sure is not common in the US. And we have daycare assistance programs. We, here in Quebec, we have a universal medication for meds program. And of course, within Canada, there are regional differences. For example, there are higher rates of unionization here in Quebec than anywhere else in North America. And I would say in certain parts of Canada, government intervention, government assistance, and universal, programs are seen as a positive. But then there's other parts of Canada, like Alberta, where, it's an oil and gas industry, very different from Ontario and Quebec, and things, obviously function differently. But for interest for the US, as of 2019, the Canadian corporate tax rate is only 15%. And contrary to popular belief, it is one of the lowest internationally. So doing business in Canada makes sense for a lot of American companies for many reasons. One is the US currency, which is much stronger than the Canadian currency. And yesterday I was actually watching a new TV show, an American TV show, and they were making fun of the Canadian currency, how weak it is. So definitely the US currency gives the ability to an American corporation to hire people at a much lower cost. And there's the next thing about Canada is that we do have a highly educated and highly skilled workforce. According to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, Canada ranks second for the highest share of 25 to 34-year-olds that are highly educated, that have completed post-secondary education. I believe it's up to 65% have completed post-secondary education. So for American companies that are looking for either highly skilled, educated individuals, coming to Canada to hire, and we see it with a lot of Southern Californian companies, software and IT companies that have set shop here in Montreal or Toronto to hire people in software and IT. So we see that often, and of course we have similar processes when it comes to background checks, credit criminal verifications, etc. The US in most states goes a little bit further than we do in Canada. So there's certain testing that, for example, drug testing is not across the board in Canada. It has to be for very specific positions. Even credit verification is only allowed for certain industries and only in certain provinces. But having said that, definitely Canada provides a great opportunity for American companies that are looking to expand. and or increase their revenue.
Themis, to that point, actually, there's two really good questions that I want to kind of combine into one as a good segue from what you're talking about also. With the whole gig economy, right, which has been huge globally, but really, really large, a big part of what's happening here in the US also. And Joseph mentioned that our speaker last month actually was somebody from DoorDash. But whether it's DoorDash or Uber or Lyft or Postmates or whatever it might be, how has that shifted, right? Has that become a bigger part of the economy up there in terms of the contactless business, if you will, on the food side? And then also, how has Canada in general been able to do such a good job of getting better compliance with COVID? And is it just kind of these gig economy employees are more compliant and they're a bigger part of the population, or a bigger part of the business community, or is it something different? So it's kind of a bit of a combination of questions, if you don't mind me doing so.
Well, I'll kind of, if you don't mind, Themis, I'll kind of jump in. The first part about why has Canada been able to, let's not mince words. Canada has been more effective, I believe, in containing the COVID crisis. I think ultimately, I don't want to get too deep into this. This is sort of a political, cultural thing. It's kind of beyond, above my pay grade, so to speak. But I do believe that, generally speaking, for better or for worse, Canada is a more compliant people. You know what I'm saying? So Americans are very, again, these are very big generalizations. So please I don't want to.
No, it's fine, sure.
Get to it.
We know we're not all that compliant. Trust me, it's not a secret for us.
Well, that's also the source of America's strength, right? Very dynamic people, probably the most dynamic people in the history of the world. Very go-getter, very entrepreneurial, very driving, very pioneering type of spirit. But with that comes, and I think it goes right back to the founding of the country. Again, I'm not a historian, but very much that that mentality of staking your claim and going out and exploring. So it's a very Canada is a different breed. It was more of a loyalist country, right? Let's stay with the British Crown. Let's stay with, very much so it's there's a different culture, there's a different mentality. So the end result is that I think we're more compliant people. So when our government says, this may rankle some Canadians, but generally when our government sort of comes down with, I think this is what we need to do to fight a pandemic, we're more compliant. There's a little bit less of a rebellious spirit to that. So for better or for worse, again, I really hesitate. I don't want to advance much more on this topic just because
I would like to add, if I can just add, not to give Canadians too much credit, we are also compliant because government assistance programs are far more interesting than the ones in the US. So we've had rental subsidies where the government is helping to pay the rent for many corporations and especially retailers. We've had the CERB program where every Canadian was able to get $2,000 a month for many months. We have a generous employment insurance program. We have many subsidies. So it's kind of, it's like saying, is my 16-year-old going to be compliant since I'm paying the rent, supplying the food and giving them an allowance? Yes, we are compliant because we depend on government assistance. Yeah. I think that is an important point. Yeah. And compliance comes with a price. So, and that price is that, we sort of listen, when I'll give you an example, the Premier of Quebec last week has made it illegal for any gatherings in a house. I'm not allowed to invite Richard's family to my house at this point. So in some countries that would seem severe, and we won't touch the political part, and yet in Quebec, everyone is complying, and people are not visiting anyone, and everyone for Thanksgiving, we just celebrated Canadian Thanksgiving, celebrated alone at home. Again, we're being compliant because we're receiving the funds and we're receiving assistance.
Do you see, I'm curious, there's a lot of discussion here in the US about, pandemic fatigue, right? Which is obvious. No one is used to it and enjoys it. We're all getting kind of tired of it. But there are some parts of the US where that fatigue has led to not only just a lack of compliance, but now kind of the complete opposite, deliberately going against whatever the rules are, right? Are you seeing up in Canada any kind of fatigue setting in where compliance maybe is not as strict as it was, the first go around?
Well, I say certainly fatigue. I think that's universal. I think that goes for pretty much everyone on the globe. But for the most part, there's a certain rebelliousness that has grown in recent weeks. This last lockdown it's been a little bitter pill to swallow. It's not fun spending Thanksgiving with just your nuclear family. But I think ultimately, not to wave the flag for any political party or leader here, I think most people have understood, or it's been communicated amongst, socially and politically, that there is something at the end of all this, right? So there's a price to pay. So I don't think, despite there is growing rebellion and growing resistance and some protests, again, there's more compliance overall. I will say, kind of switching gears to a more positive note, I think Joseph asked a question about, you mentioned DoorDash. The resilience of the Canadian economy, I think, is one that, despite the craziness of the lockdowns and even the concern here, is that the Canadian economy has proved pretty resilient. Now, I'm not going to say, sit here and say it's been perfect. It's been a bed of roses. Quite, as Themis mentioned, that there's been healthy employment insurance style benefits related to the pandemic. There's been wage subsidies to employers that have lost income. There's been rental subsidies. So all these things have kind of propped up the economy. But having said that, there's a lot of industries that, to Joseph's point, that have actually excelled, so pretty much the same DoorDash and all those services. But some industries like the sporting goods industry, auto parts, auto sales were actually higher in August of 2020 than in August of 2019, which pretty much knocked me off my chair. Yeah. Home retail sales. I mean, who here a year ago would have said in 1 year, in October of 2020, we'll be in the middle of a global pandemic and a global severe recession, that home sales and home prices will be going up in major markets and major cities in Canada? I would have never, I would have bet the farm that would not happen. That's happened. So I think ultimately, and I think Arthur, we were talking in our breakout session, I think ultimately this pandemic it's been a picnic for nobody. No industry has been spared. But there has been a kind of reflection, both individually and businesses have had to reflect on what they want to do moving forward. And I think a lot of damage will be done to some sectors, some businesses, some industries, but a lot will have actually, I hesitate to use the word benefited, but I think a lot of companies will have in fact seen an increase in business. And so our habits will change, our expectations will change, our requirements about the kinds of jobs we want to perform will shift. So I think ultimately, I'm optimistic. I feel that we've shown a certain kind of resilience, and that coming out of it, the economy will be damaged, bruised for sure. But I don't think it'll be destroyed. As I guess ultimately, the cratering we saw back in March, April, I think we will come out of it at some point and say, well, things have changed. Now, try consoling the restaurant owner whose business will be out of business within a few months. I think I echo everyone's sentiments that we feel for those people. But other businesses, we talked about DoorDash, Peloton, for example, the pet business skyrocketed, auto parts, home renovations. I mean, those are all areas that have actually boomed and actually benefited from this period. So, there we go.
And to add to Joseph's, great question about DoorDash, and also I believe Craig, you asked the question recently about have Americans, are they looking for jobs in Canada? What has happened, to my surprise, in September, the company Lyft, Lyft, which is similar to DoorDash, actually entered the Montreal market and started hiring a lot of people. And here are people now that are supporting Lyft and or DoorDash in the US from a call center in Montreal or Toronto. So what is, UPS and Amazon and Google and DoorDash hire Canadians, more and more Canadians that are, as I said, cheaper thanks to the US currency here in Canada to service not only Canadians, but also Americans. A lot of our contact centers are servicing American clients. So we see that across the board and across Canada.
Yeah, it's one of the things that we're doing, obviously, with being in the search business as well as you guys are. There's a lot of discussion going on about, whether this this kind of forced, experiment, if you will, in remote working is going to really change the fabric and kind of the dynamic of how companies hire. We just launched a new search yesterday, actually, for a very specific sales engineer. And we're talking to our client. They're based here in Southern California. And we said, does a person have to be based here in your backyard? They said, actually, no, they can be anywhere. As long as they're open to travel for this particular role, then we're okay with any place. I don't think that would have necessarily been the case for a similar SE sales engineer role, a year ago. And so we're really having that conversation with every single client now, whether it's operations or marketing or sales or anything else, because there is this feeling that, okay, well, we actually experimented for 6 months with our entire workforce being remote, and it actually went pretty well. In some cases, actually, they were more productive than they were being in the office. So we're seeing some of that happen. I don't know if it's going to extend as far as being cross-border, where companies will say, let's go and hire some of the highly educated, young talent or mid-career talent in Canada instead of the US. Are you guys seeing that? Because you actually have a partnership relationship with a US based IT training company, right? So have you seen some of that spill over yet?
Yes, absolutely. I would say not a day. And we're in the staffing and recruiting business, right, Ken? So I'm sure all our friends on the meeting today will be interested. That I think you're experiencing the exact same thing we are, that in our day-to-day discussions, there's a dynamic there. There's like a push and pull going on, right? And people are asking, well, what about after the pandemic? It's great to be working from home now. What about later and work-life balance? And now there's like a whole, this is a fascinating, we could have a whole meeting just on this topic, where you have the expectations are changing, and there's going to be some resistance. I talked about push and pull. So the expectations for IT professionals, executives that can execute and perform their job from home, no longer wanting to ever go into an office. Then you can have a little bit of the pull effect, where companies will say, well, that sounds great, but what about the sense of belonging, the sense of integration, or the cultural aspect? We have a certain cultural identity. Our company has a certain culture within it. If people are all working from home and never ever coming in to meet their colleagues, if only to small talk and get to know each other, how will that affect? Does that affect our bottom line at some point? So there's like a push and pull. I don't think it's going to be solved overnight. My own feeling is that I still believe, and the employment numbers bear this out, if a terrible 100-year pandemic doesn't really affect the unemployment rate among high-level IT professionals or executives, they're still in the driver's seat again, right? So I have a feeling that in the end, most employers will have no choice but to figure out a way, be creative, as Microsoft has done and other companies have done, and say, you know what, this is the new reality. It's work from home permanently. And so there may be resistance. I think employers that resist too long may regret it in 2-3 years. Their employer brand may be affected. I think they may be losing some of the best talent. And there's not a day that goes by where I don't speak to a candidate where that's important. It says, I understand working from home now, it's great for 6-7 months, but what about in 18 months from now, when this is in the rear view, hopefully in the rear view mirror? What then? What will be the work from home policy then? So I personally, that's an earthquake, in terms of how to recruit, how businesses will operate, where they're going to staff, how they're going to manage staff, HR issues. And I think that's going to be the big legacy of this pandemic. Even once the initial economic damage is behind us, we'll still be living with a very different workplace, and I think permanently, actually.
No, I agree.
To answer Joseph's question, what kind of cars do Canadians So a very good question. Canadians, from my research here, the top 2 cars are Toyota and Honda. So most Canadians, a lot of sales for Toyota and Honda. But interestingly enough, Canadians are also very loyal to American cars. So, the Chevrolet Silverado comes in the top 5. And the Ford Escape is in the top 7 cars that are purchased by Canadians. But Tesla, to answer your question, Joseph, Tesla has definitely made an entrance into Canada, and Canadians, more and more Canadians are buying Teslas. We see here, especially being in Quebec, where we have an abundance of hydropower, and we sell a lot of hydro power to neighboring states. And we see a lot of people interested in Tesla. So we see definitely a significant increase in those purchases, although most Canadians are still purchasing a lot of Toyotas and Hondas, but you know, Ford and GM cars are up there.
Yeah, it's funny because the whole topic of shifts that we talked about. So in the first few months of the pandemic, services took a beating. Obviously, restaurants, tourism, hotel, all those service-based industries. But the goods industry, and namely goods that are pretty good investments like cars, actually increased. So car sales, talking about Tesla and Ford and GM, so their sales have actually gone up in Canada. I never ever would have imagined that in a pandemic. So the people would be buying more cars than 2019. So yes, and personally, I do want to buy a Tesla. That's on my wish list for the next 2-3 years.
What about in terms of compensation? So one of the other discussions that's happening now, and this is kind of being driven by a lot of the big tech companies that are in Silicon Valley, where we know that it's by far the most expensive part of the country, and very unrealistic pre-COVID. But rental rates have dropped. Vacancies have increased dramatically with people fleeing these big cities. And so a lot of tech companies are saying, yes, you're allowed to move if you want to a less expensive part of the country. Well, you can keep your job remotely. However, they are now putting in place cost of living adjustments, and these adjustments are actually going down. So they're going to decrease your compensation if you move from Silicon Valley or the Bay Area to Denver or wherever it's going to be. And so there's this big conversation happening out there among companies in the HR community. Is that really equitable? Does that make sense? Is that fair? Is that kind of a discussion starting to happen up in Canada also?
Yes. This is part of the push and pull that I was talking about. And it's there's not, I follow the HRPA in Canada daily. There's a Quebec order as well of HR professionals. These are debates that are ongoing, seminars, exchanges, newsletters. I don't think, it's a tough question to answer, Ken, just because it's such a fluid situation. And again, companies have to tread very, very carefully, when you're approaching high-level talent in that way, right? So it's very legitimate to say, well, yes, you've moved from downtown Montreal or downtown Vancouver or Santa Monica or wherever it is to a quieter, lower cost of living. We're going to adjust your compensation. You're going to get some pushback from candidates that say, well, how does that affect your bottom line? I'm doing the same work. So I wish I could sit here and give you an answer as to how that's going to play out, but it's definitely open for debate. And if a client was asking my opinion, I'd say tread very carefully when you're pushing those kinds of cost of living deductions or decreases in your comp. Be very, very careful, especially the larger picture is that, and again, this just blew me away about the resiliency of the economy, that yes, we're all battered and bruised, but I think we'll come out of it okay, is that we're at 97% of the employment level of February in Canada, right? Really? So that stands to reason that people in those harder to find skill sets, IT being one of them, engineering, high-level executives, they're still in the driver's seat, to a certain degree. It's almost like they're still on the better side of the desk, so to speak, when they're negotiating. So I would caution companies to not be too aggressive in negotiating those types of cost of living adjustments or decreases.
Right. I would add, though, interestingly enough, there's a difference between Canada and the US. Americans tend to be very mobile within their own country. So if someone has an opportunity in Phoenix, Arizona, and they currently live in New Jersey, they will, think seriously about the move. We see a lot less mobility in Canada between provinces, especially where Quebec is concerned, because Quebecers usually speak French first, and English may be their second language. You won't find the numbers of Quebecers, looking at opportunities in British Columbia. So what we find is mobility within Canada is a little bit less significant than you see in the US. Yes, there's mobility, especially in what is coined as English Canada. So somebody from Ontario going to British Columbia and vice versa. But this cost of living adjustment that you brought up, et cetera, there are certain provinces where mobility is pretty stagnant. they're not leaving the province. So yes, they may be leaving the urban area. They're leaving Montreal for, you know, some northern areas of Quebec. But we don't see that same mobility within our country as you would see in the US.
Interesting.
Talking about, Joseph, excellent question about climate change, and I think Richard can probably answer more. Canada, you know, on an international stage, has been, you know, a proponent for cutting emissions, you know, and we have lots of funds that we've set up to combat climate change. The Canadian government is definitely dedicated to helping where climate change is concerned. So you asked the question, you know, between Canada and the US. I can't really speak for the US, although we hear in the news you know, the proponents for and against climate change. But here in Canada, definitely it's something that's important to many Canadians. We even have a national party called the Green Party, although they do not have many seats in Parliament. They actually, I think in the last election, won maybe 2 or 3 seats, and they do get a percentage of population. So we actually have in our federal elections a party that it's called the Green Party, and they're dedicated to protecting the environment, looking at the effects of climate change, etc. So Canada, you know, and of course for us, you know, when we hear that the Arctic and the glaciers are melting, you know, we see it in our own. I mean, when I was a child, snowstorms were, you know, every 2-3 days, and now, you know, we can count on one hand how many snowstorms we get between December and March. You know, we know in our lifetime we've seen climate change. Now, the reasons behind climate change, that's a whole other debate, and that's a whole other discussion. But to answer your question, Joseph, Canada is very committed and is taking steps where climate change is concerned.
Great. Let's switch gears a little bit and talk about, you know, kind of the types of companies that you're working with. I'm curious about whether you're seeing any change or evolution, if you will, among leaders. Right, because, you know, I keep using this term line of sight management, right? Where, you know, pre-COVID, a lot of leaders, a lot of managers felt like if they couldn't see their employees, then they couldn't really trust them, and how are they working effectively? How were they being productive? And now I think because everybody is remote, everybody is working, you know, physically in different areas, it's required, if you will, it's forced a lot of leaders to change their ability or change their style of management and how they lead and how they run people and how they monitor. But also how they engage people. Are you seeing any change in conversations that you're having with your clients at the C-suite level around that leadership change, that shift in approach or strategy?
Yeah, no, certainly. It's an excellent question. You know, there's one client in particular who shall remain nameless, who is pretty adamant that they're going to stick to an on-site 100% of the time model. That's a difficult one to kind of, you know, again, we're as a search firm, we're in a consultancy type of role, but, you know, we're not, you have to tread very difficult. I think that's an error to kind of, you know, be very adamant about sticking to the old model. I think companies will have to adapt. I've seen other clients that have been very adaptable and actually very creative, not just from technology standpoint, but how they're going to compensate these people, how they're going to engage them, how they're going to, you know, favor some on-site work more with incentive, you know, more incentive based than forcing employees back to the office. So it's, you know what, Ken, it's all over the map. You know, it's almost like it's an alphabet soup right now. We're just stirring, and we're going to see when things settle down if it spells anything coherent, right? So. Right. But again, you know, I'm in favor of companies being creative, putting their thinking caps on, having their eyes and ears open and their hearts open to what their key talent will be telling them. And I really don't see that, depending on the type of worker, obviously, 100% on-site work ever coming back, you know, and you know, there's other larger issues. We can debate that over a beer sometime, but how that's going to affect downtowns and the restaurant business and hospitality and expense accounts and traveling. It's definitely a major earthquake. I think there's some changes that will not be undone. So strictly from a recruiting standpoint and staffing and how companies will manage their talent, you got to be creative. You got to open your eyes and ears and start thinking about 2021 and 2022 now. Don't be the last one. Don't be the last one to be offering this as a long-term option. And if you do want them on site, be creative. You're going to be losing people quickly if otherwise.
Yeah, and I think these companies have to do a better job of really kind of justifying if they are going to have a job on site. Why is it a manufacturing plant? Is it running a warehouse? I mean, do you have to be physically there, or is it just because that's the way it's always been done? That's no longer going to cut it. There's got to be some other reason behind it.
And the funny thing is also from a non-business point of view, I think we're similar age, although you look much younger than I do, Ken, where going into work and dressing up when we were in our 20s and 30s, that was great. That was amazing. That's where you met people. That's where you expanded your social circle. And I've talked to enough young people. Again, this is just a personal observation. I don't have any data to back it up. I don't think they have that expectation that their workplace is there to enhance their social life. You know what I mean? So they don't necessarily need, it's in talking with many people. I wish I could crunch some numbers and come up with something more concrete, but my intuition and my observation is that younger, let's say millennials, don't really, it sounds sad to me because some of the best memories and friendships I've made were, for my 20s, friendships I made in my 20s were at the workplace, but they don't seem to have that expectation or even that desire. So I think work from home is almost, I don't think there's any way that companies will get around it. I think they're going to have to accommodate and find a way to work with it as best they can and find innovative ways of keeping that generation of workers happy and engaged remotely.
Yeah.
Ken, to answer your question about, what are, managers and others doing, first of all, we see in our, in recruiting and staffing, we've noticed since March, when it comes to our banking clients, our clients in the financial services sector, there's been no change. They actually have not cut any of the employees, and we have temporary staff at many of these clients. They've been able to move them to remote, but of course their laptops with VPN and other monitoring technologies, your laptop is being monitored. So if you're not working and you're on Facebook, your manager can see that. And with more and more technologies, when it comes to, and there's a whole argument about, how much monitoring is allowed. And, but at this point, employers are being transparent, telling their remote employees, I'm giving you this laptop, but you're being monitored. What you see, what you do, is being monitored every second. So in that case, an employer can see, yes, Richard is preparing that Excel report, or is he spending all his time on Instagram and Facebook, right? So, how
did you know, Themis?
So we've seen certain sectors move to remote work quite quickly and efficiently. But like in the US, in Canada, the hardest hit has been the hospitality industry. The airlines, especially our national airline, Air Canada, has been hard hit with thousands and thousands of layoffs. So certain industries are really hit hard, but other industries, as Richard mentioned, are doing really well. And one of the sectors people don't really think of is the education sector. And here in Canada, the education sector has had the highest increase, both in numbers of people being employed in this sector now, but also in terms of revenue, because, teaching, be it online teaching at a school, we're having a problem in Quebec finding enough teachers who are willing to teach, because many have taken early retirement due to COVID. Many are refusing to work due to COVID. And right now our elementary, high schools, universities and colleges are looking for teachers, and we just can't find them. So there's certain industries that are growing and actually have a need for people, and that need is not necessarily being met.
Interesting, yeah. Well, and I think, I mean, just to kind of end this on a, I guess, a positive note, I would say, you know, we've been doing a survey of clients and contacts over the last few months. And one of the questions we've been asking is, you know, have you or are you planning on introducing a new product or a new solution that wasn't on the radar screen, wasn't on the drawing table pre-COVID? And I've been impressed and surprised, but also excited by the fact that, you know, about 40% of the folks I'm talking to have said yes. And they said, you know, this innovation, this kind of forced innovation, or, you know, this forced, you know, kind of looking in the mirror at their business and rather than being complacent as we all were a year ago, now realizing, okay, so what are some things that we can do that we have to do to adapt that's going to be more effective? And you look at all the examples, every recession, you know, for the last, you know, number of decades, every recession has created a number of brand new companies that, you know, 5, 8, 7, 10 years later are powerhouses. Look at Google, look at HP, all the companies that were started in a garage or as an academic experiment during a recession because people had more time and lost their jobs. You know, that really is coming to fruition now as well. So I think whether it's education or hospitality or a different way that we eat out, whatever it's going to be, those innovations will really, you know, blossom over the next, you know, 2 to 5 years, and we'll see the positive results among all this negativity out there too. So that's what I'm hopeful for.
Definitely, I agree with you. There will be opportunity, and I think well, the forecasts for 2021 are good, both in Canada and the U.S. So I think just to end it on an interesting note, so you guys can understand, so you can all see how we take the U.S. very seriously. Not only our Canadian Prime Minister, but across the board, we already have a plan of preparedness if Donald Trump wins, and another plan if Joe Biden wins. So Canadians are already prepared for either scenario, with our Canadian Prime Minister actually having a plan of preparedness for either result, which is unheard of in any other country, right? That they would prepare for, you know, the election results in another country.
Right, exactly.
Just so you know that we are extremely, extremely intertwined. That's a good, but as I started, I'll end with, you know, most Canadians, I've traveled more in the US than I've ever traveled in Canada. I think Richard can probably say the same thing. And for many of us, you know, the US is family. So we are so comfortable and we feel at home in the US. And we hope that the Americans listening today are looking to Canada. When permitted, please visit beautiful Montreal, Toronto, Vancouver, and across the country. And if you need to reach out to us, you're more than welcome to. And once again, thank you so much, Ken, for this great opportunity to be part of this event.
That was great. Yeah, no, I agree. And it's nice to know that we now have 2 contacts up there that if we are traveling, we know who can help us figure out which restaurants to go to and where to stay. So thank you guys for being our Canadian counterparts. Wonderful. All right. Well, have a good rest of your week, everybody. Stay safe out there. And if you haven't already, make sure you vote.
All right. Thank you very much, Ken. Appreciate the invite.
Thanks, guys. Take care. Bye.
Take care.